For years, Ezra Marsh lived alone, wrapped in the icy winds of the Silverbuds Hills, where snow fell earlier than anywhere else in the territory. He wasn't young, but not yet old either. He had lived through 32 winters, his face hardened by more than he ever cared to speak of. In his cabin, built by his own hands on the hillside, there was no place for visitors, no memory of the noise from towns, just firewood, long silences, and a pot that never left the stove. He used to work as an interpreter between ranchers and tribes. He spoke fluent Comanche and Spanish, but when blood began spilling despite the treaties, he stopped translating for others and started trying to understand himself. He had seen women fall under gunfire, children ripped from their mothers' arms, and elders barely covered with blankets, abandoned to the cold. When he raised his voice, no one listened. So, he went quiet. For good. That late November afternoon, Ezra was splitting logs behind the cabin. His gloves were worn thin, and the heels of his boots had cracked open. The spruce still smelled of resin, fresh and damp. He struck each log with the rhythm of someone who wasn't thinking, just preparing to outlast another winter. The stew pot simmered on the stove, and a chunk of goat meat waited to turn into supper. That's when the air shifted. It wasn't the wind, it was footsteps, several of them. Light. Human. Ezra froze, the axe hanging in midair, ears sharp. He moved around the cabin, hand near his revolver, though he hadn't drawn it yet. There, between frost-covered shrubs, stood 5 women in a silent line at the edge of the clearing. No horses, no wagons, just bare feet, red from the cold, and dresses torn from what once had been dignity. They wore blankets draped over their shoulders, and on their faces, exhaustion without defeat. The one in front had a strong frame and dark hair tied back with a tendon cord. She stepped forward. She didn't beg for help. She simply said, her voice dry but steady, "We just need a place. One night. Nothing more." Ezra didn't answer. He watched. Noticed the youngest, blood trickling down her thigh. Another held her arm, clearly in pain. None of them spoke further, but everyone told her story through posture. They weren't beggars. They were survivors. He glanced toward the trees. No sign of riders. Nothing to suggest a trap. He remembered the last time he trusted someone. A drunken trapper stole his horse and his trust. But these weren't men. They were Apache widows. Proud. Half wild, maybe, but not broken. Without saying a word, Ezra opened the gate to the fence. They stepped in, one by one. Watching him as they passed, measuring the man who didn't ask a thing. Inside, the fire was already dying, and the night was just beginning. Ezra Marsh added another log to the fire, stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, and grabbed a bowl from the shelf. He served what was left of the previous night's stew, thick, filled with roots and tough meat, and handed out the bowls without saying a word. The women gathered in a circle near the flames. Iva Redbird, the one who had spoken outside, remained on her knees, hands open to the heat. The dress she wore was torn across the chest. Ezra noticed the rip. Someone had sewn it shut once, but the fabric had split again. Her skin, darkened by the sun, was damp with cold sweat. She didn't try to cover up or act uncomfortable. Ezra's throat tightened. It wasn't desire or shame that stirred in him, but a quiet, old rage. Who had done that to her? The youngest, Taya, though he didn't yet know her name, was trembling as she drank. She didn't cry, didn't complain, just swallowed slowly, her eyes wide and worn to the core. They hadn't come seeking charity. They had come because there was nowhere else left. After the meal, Ezra handed them folded wool blankets. He didn't ask names. He didn't try for conversation. That's not how you earn the trust of the hunted. He opened a chest and pulled out a couple of old cots, arranging a space near the stove. The floor was hard, but less cruel than the snow outside. He laid the last blanket near Iva. She looked up at him without fear, only assessing. Her eyes scanned his face, his posture, the belt at his waist. She knew he was armed, knew he lived alone, knew he could do whatever he pleased. But he did nothing. Ezra stepped back and sat by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness in case someone had followed them. Behind him, he heard them settle in. One of the women began murmuring softly. Another let out a short, near-silent laugh. Eva replied in her tongue, and then silence returned. It sounded like home, or the memory of one. Ezra didn't sleep all the way through that night. He kept watch over the door, listened to the creak of the firewood, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that 5 strangers had entered his cabin. And he wasn't afraid. No. What he felt was something else. Responsibility. It pressed on his chest with the same weight as the snow piling on the roof. And still, he didn't send them away. Dawn came cold and still. Ezra was already awake before the sun rose over the ridge. He'd slept in the chair, boots still on, rifle resting in his lap. His neck ached, but he didn't stretch. He listened first. The 5 women were still asleep, wrapped in blankets, breathing in unison while the fire had dwindled to coals. Sorel, tall and sharp-eyed like a hawk, lay by the door as if she were standing guard even in sleep. Taya was curled up, her face buried in her arms. The others lay across the floor, wrapped in wool and what few rags they carried. Ezra set the rifle aside, walked over to the stove, lit the fire with care, and added water to the pot. His hands moved on their own, guided by a habit older than fear. When the first light stained the wooden floorboards, Iva pushed herself up on one elbow. Her hair was loose across her neck, and the buckskin dress she wore was wrinkled, still torn at the chest. She didn't cover herself. She watched him. Not shy, not seductive. Just measuring. Ezra held her gaze and gave a small nod. She stood. They exchanged no words. Ezra handed her a tin of coffee. Iva understood the gesture and measured out portions without asking. By the time the others woke, the scent of coffee filled the cabin. Steam rose from the mugs like winter breath. They ate goat stew again. No one complained, not even the youngest. After breakfast, Iva stepped outside without saying a word. The others followed. Ezra stayed inside, letting the door swing shut behind them. He watched from the window. They moved with purpose. Eva checked the goat pen, testing each animal's response one by one. Deli picked up a torn blanket from the railing and sat down to mend it. Sorel circled the cabin, scanning the hills like she was expecting someone. Marnie dragged a bucket to the well without being asked. Taya stood in place, blowing warm air into her hands to fight the cold. They weren't guests. They were survivors. And survivors don't sit still. Ezra stepped out and picked up the axe again. The sun had barely lifted the frost off the roof when Iva Redbird appeared beside him, without asking. She crouched slowly and began gathering kindling, stacking it neatly against the wall. She moved carefully, with pain, but with a stubbornness that demanded respect. Her dress clung to her legs each time she bent down. Snow dampened the fabric, and through a wider tear than usual, more skin showed than she might have realized. Or maybe she did know, but didn't need to look to know if he was watching. By noon, the air was still sharp, but the ice had started to give. Inside the cabin, Ezra laid out what little remained on the table. A handful of flour, some lard, salt, and a piece of dried meat. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, watching as Marnie and Deli began preparing the meal. One kneaded, the other cleaned the surface. They didn't speak. Only the rhythm of hands and the faint creak of wood marked the moment. The questions crowded his mind. Who were they? Where had they come from? Why now? He didn't ask. But that afternoon, Iva stood at the doorway while the others kept busy. And at last, she broke the silence. "We come from south of Fort Garland," she said bluntly. "We were attacked. A group of drunk white ranchers thought we were hiding warriors." She looked him straight in the eye. It wasn't true. Ezra didn't respond. He just watched her. There were visible marks on her temple, old scars across her neck. "Most of us lost our men months ago," she went on, "but that doesn't matter to them. Widow or not. They take what they want." Ezra didn't look away, but he still said nothing. His eyes held no pity, only understanding. "They burned our shelter, took what little we had left. We walked 5 days. 5 days. In the snow, barefoot." She stepped inside. "We saw your smoke. From the ridge we figured a man lived here alone, but we wouldn't have come closer if that weren't true." Ezra looked at her for a moment. "And were you right?" She smiled, barely, then let the smile fade. "We won't stay long, just long enough to move on." He didn't answer. At dusk, he went out to the shed and brought back extra tools. An old axe, nails, rope. He didn't explain. Just set them down on the table. Sorrel had already fixed the back door. Deli was stitching up a torn curtain. Marnie adjusted the latch like it was her own house. Ezra, coffee cup in hand, watched them from the porch. They moved with ease, like they'd always been there. None of them asked what was expected. None waited for rules. Eva passed beside him to go inside. Her hip brushed his knee lightly. It wasn't quite an accident, but not entirely on purpose either. Their eyes met again. That night, all 5 slept inside. The blankets were drawn closer to the stove. Taya curled up next to Deli. Sorrel returned to her spot by the door, arms folded. Marnie lay on her back, eyes open in the dark. Eva chose the farthest corner, right where Ezra sat every night. She didn't close her eyes right away. She turned to face him. "I know what men expect," she murmured. Ezra didn't respond. "And I know what people will say, if we stay too long." He remained silent. She studied his face, the scar near his eye, the tightness in his shoulders. She nodded, as if to herself, and turned away. Ezra stood there for a long time, staring at the door, then at the fire, then at the silhouette of her back beneath the blanket. And for the first time in many winters, he didn't feel like he was keeping watch. He felt like he belonged, and he didn't send them away. That night, the snowfall was heavy. By dawn, everything lay blanketed in white. No tracks, no wind, no sound. Just the hush of a low gray sky stretched tight above. Inside, the air was warm, but thick. The fire had almost burned out. The scent of boiled coffee hung in the room. The wood creaked faintly. No one spoke. Ezra sat at the table, sharpening his knife. The rasp of wet stone against steel matched the rhythm of his breathing. Ezra sharpened slowly, with an old patience. Across from him, Iva Redbird stood near the stove, adding more water to the pot. Her dress clung to her legs, still wet from stepping onto the porch through the snow. She hadn't asked permission. She took the bucket, filled it, and returned like the house was hers too. The others moved without speaking. Deli swept near the hearth. Taya folded a blanket with clumsy care. Sorel, ever alert, checked the window for drafts. Marnie remained near the door, arms crossed, as if still unsure whether it was safe to go back outside. Eva was the first to speak. "You get visitors from town?" Ezra didn't look up. "No." She waited. "Does anyone bring you supplies?" "I go down once a month." Then she did look at him. "Not until after the thaw." Iva nodded slowly. That told her everything. No one would come up to check. There'd be no questions, no curious eyes. If something happened here, it wouldn't be known until spring. She went back to the stove. Ezra noticed how she moved. Yes, with pain, but with resolve. Her shoulders carried tension, not exhaustion. She wasn't a woman recovering. She was someone who hadn't rested in weeks, maybe months. After breakfast, Ezra pulled a map from the chest beside his bed and spread it across the table. It was old, stained with oil and rain, frayed at the edges. He pointed to the valley below. "There's a trail down to Carson Fork. Follow the river south. There are some posts down there." Eva stepped closer. "You want us to leave?" He met her gaze. "I'm showing you the way, in case you're still planning to go." She placed her hands on the edge of the table, so close her fingers brushed the blade of the freshly sharpened knife. "We would have kept walking," she said. "But the youngest—" She gestured toward Taya, who was sitting near the fire, tying a cloth around her foot. "She can't anymore. Her wounds are older than what we told you." Ezra looked over at her. The cloth was stained with blood. Taya noticed and pulled her dress down in embarrassment, trying to cover her legs. Ezra turned back to Iva. "I've got a salve. It's not much, but it'll help." Iva nodded. "We'll work to pay for it." "I didn't ask you to." She stared hard at him. "You're not offering it for me. You're offering it for her." Ezra didn't argue. He picked up the tin and sat down on the floor beside Taya. The girl shrank back, but he didn't touch her. He simply opened the lid and set it down beside her knee. "You do it," he said softly, "and wrap it good after." Taya looked at him once more, then took the jar. Sorel moved behind her, keeping her eyes on Ezra. She said nothing, but a flicker of relief crossed her face. That afternoon, the cabin was filled with quiet movement. Deli asked for a needle and thread and repaired Ezra's coat, stitching the shoulder with care. Marnie cleaned the shelves. Taya rested. Eva spent most of her time outside. Ezra heard the sound of the axe again. Once. Twice. He stood and stepped out onto the porch. Eva was splitting kindling beside the shed, her breath rising in white clouds. Her dress was soaked from kneeling in the snow. The tear at the chest still hadn't been fixed, hanging loose, showing more than necessary. He didn't know if she realized he was watching, or if she simply didn't care. Ezra stepped forward and set a new log on the stump. "That blade's too light," she said. "It works," he grunted. Still, he handed her a heavier axe. Eva took it with a sure grip and brought it down clean, hard, like someone who worked to survive, not to impress. Ezra nodded. "You're from White Mountain." Eva stopped, sweat tracing the back of her neck. She didn't answer. "Not after Forge came down," he added. She looked at him. The way she spoke, the way she held herself. It wasn't the bearing of a tribal noble or a valley farmer's wife. Something in between. "You worked with the army," he said. "They sent you here." "I didn't leave." She didn't ask why, and Ezra knew she already understood. They finished splitting the wood and went inside together. That night, it snowed again. Ezra cooked fresh meat from a rabbit he'd hunted days earlier, while the world outside turned white and still once more. He added no herbs to the stew, only the flavor of the meat and what the cold had brought. Yet the scent that filled the cabin was warmer than the fire itself. After supper, the mood settled into calm. Not the kind of silence that makes one uneasy, but a shared rest, as if every body had found its rightful place. Iva Redbird sat close to the embers. She stretched out her legs, one knee bent. The tear in her dress shifted with her, revealing part of her thigh. Ezra noticed, but said nothing. He didn't stare. Just one glance, brief. She, on the other hand, watched him openly. Not inviting, not challenging, just watching to see if he'd look away, and he didn't. Later, when the others were asleep, Iva stood and poured herself some water. She didn't drink it. She remained in the doorway, caught between the shadows and the flickering light of the fire. "You're not like the others," she said. Ezra didn't move from his chair. "I've known quiet men," she continued, "and patient ones too. But most of them, sooner or later, expect something in return." He held her gaze. Iva studied him in silence, until her expression softened. "I don't know what I expect," she admitted, "but I'm not afraid." She stepped closer, close enough for Ezra to feel the warmth of her body. Her dress clung to her chest, rising and falling evenly with her breath. Her face was weathered by wind, smoke, and travel. And still, there was beauty. Not delicate beauty, but the kind earned through wounds and grit. Ezra didn't touch her. He said nothing. She stood there a moment longer, then turned and went back to her place. He stared into the fire. He couldn't tell whether what was stirring inside was trust or temptation. But he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want them to leave, not a single one of them. And that thought scared him more than he'd admit. "Do it yourself," Ezra said quietly, placing the jar by her knee. "Just keep it covered after." Taya looked at him only once, then reached out and took the salve. Across the cabin, Sorrel stood behind her, silent, watching Ezra's every move. She didn't speak, but a faint sense of relief appeared on her face, like something inside her had finally eased. That afternoon, the cabin breathed in peace. Deli asked for a needle and thread and sat to mend Ezra's coat, stitching the shoulder seam with patience. Marnie cleaned the shelves as if this had always been her home. Taya rested, curled up near the warmth. Eva spent nearly the entire afternoon outside. Ezra heard the sound of the axe again. Once. Twice. He stood, curious, and stepped out onto the porch. He found her beside the shed, splitting kindling. Her breath left her mouth in white clouds. Her dress was soaked with snow, knees stained with cold dirt. The tear across her chest was still there, unrepaired. It hung loose, revealing more than she might realize. Or maybe she did realize, and didn't care. Ezra walked up quietly and set another log on the chopping block. "That blade's too light," Iva commented without stopping. Ezra grunted. "It works." Even so, he handed her a heavier axe. Iva took it, adjusted her grip, and brought it down with clean, precise force, like someone splitting wood not out of habit, but out of need. Ezra gave a respectful nod. "You're from White Mountain." Iva paused. Sweat already clung to her neck. She didn't answer. "You don't seem like you're from Forge," he added. "The way you speak, the way you carry yourself, you're not tribal nobility, but you're not one of the valley wives either." She looked at him carefully. "You worked with the army, didn't you? They sent you here." "No, I stayed." She didn't ask why. and Ezra knew she already understood. They finished splitting the wood without another word and went back inside together. That night, it snowed again. Ezra cooked some fresh meat from a rabbit he'd hunted days before, while the snow slowly covered the land. The next morning, Ezra woke earlier than usual. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but at some point the warmth from the stove had faded, and the cold wrapped around him. Thick smoke hung low in the air. He sat up slowly from the chair by the fire. Stretching carefully, he scanned the cabin. They were all still there. Eva was curled up, her face turned toward the embers. Sorel, as always, near the door. Deli had shifted during the night, and now had her arms stretched over Taya's legs, as if covering her. Marnie lay flat on her back, hands crossed over her chest. Ezra walked to the stove and stirred the fire back to life. His movements were quiet. As he poured water into the pot, he sensed someone getting up. Iva stepped beside him, noiseless. They stood so close their shoulders touched. "I thought you might have left before we woke," she whispered. "I don't go far," he replied. Eva glanced at him sideways. "You always stay on the edge, like you don't really want to be in it." Ezra didn't answer. Outside, the snow kept falling. That kind of snow that doesn't stop until everything is covered. Iva poured 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. She didn't ask, just placed it in his hand like she'd done it 100 times before. Ezra drank, and finally asked what he'd been holding back since the beginning. "You said bounty hunters attacked your shelter. What happened after?" Iva took a sip. "They came at night. Said they were looking for 2 men who'd stolen horses down in the canyon. They had no proof, just guns and liquor." Her jaw tightened. "They hit Sorrel first. Said she was mocking them. Then they grabbed Marnie's bag. We didn't have much food. They took it anyway." Ezra glanced toward Marnie, still asleep. Her face looked peaceful, but a faint bruise showed beneath one eye. "They burned everything," Iva said softly. "They didn't kill us. Said we were lucky." She paused. "We weren't with any tribe." She shook her head. "No tribe takes in widows without status, and we had no men left to speak for us." Ezra nodded slowly, very slowly, and he said nothing more. Ezra understood that better than anyone. In this land, protection didn't come from the law. It came from whoever chose to stand beside you. After breakfast, he went out to check the traps. Snow still blanketed the valley, but the sky had started to clear. He followed the trail down to the creek. He caught a rabbit and a squirrel, just enough for a simple dinner, if rationed right. He returned before noon. As he climbed the rise, he paused. The cabin no longer looked the same. Smoke rose from the chimney, and another thin column curled behind the shed. His hand moved to his belt, alert. But as he got closer, he saw there was no danger. Iva had built a second fire pit, and around it the women worked calmly, each knowing exactly what to do. Marnie was boiling cloth in a tin bucket. Deli scraped rabbit skins with a bone tool. Taya was wrapped in blankets by the fire. Her foot bandage looked more secure now, and something like a smile rested on her face. Sorel looked up when she saw Ezra, but said nothing, just gave a small nod. He walked over to Iva, who was splitting wood beside the pile. "You set it up quick," he said. "We don't want to burn through your wood or your food," she replied. "If the weather lets us, we'll cook outside." Ezra handed her the rabbit he carried. She looked at him, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "You didn't have to stay either," he answered. That night they ate better than ever. Rabbit stew with a bit of dried chili Iva pulled from a small pouch hidden beneath her skirt. It was the first time they all sat at the table together. There weren't many words. But when Marnie laughed softly at something Deli said in Apache, it didn't sound bitter. It was a gentle laugh, and something inside Ezra's chest eased. Later, after the dishes were washed and the floor swept clean, Iva remained seated as the others drifted off. She waited until Ezra stepped back toward the stove. "Still waiting for us to ask for more?" she asked. He turned to her. "No." "Really not?" she pressed. "You think sooner or later we'll demand something? Your bed, your food, your life?" Ezra looked at her. "I don't think that." "Then, what do you think?" He didn't answer right away. Eva stood up, walked slowly until she was right in front of him. The firelight traced the scar along her lip, the curve of her neck exposed by that torn dress she never mended. "I know what men see when they look at me now," she said. "I know what they're after." Ezra swallowed hard, not from desire, from something deeper, older. "I'm not like them," he murmured. "I know," she replied, holding his gaze. "That is the problem." They were so close the air felt heavier. She raised her hand and placed it on his chest. Her fingers were cold. His heartbeat was steady under her palm. Ezra didn't move, but he didn't push her away either. She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a quick kiss or a timid one. Her mouth was warm, patient, searching him. When she pulled back, she didn't explain. She didn't apologize. She simply whispered, "Good night," and walked back to her corner. Ezra didn't move for a long while. He didn't sleep, but he didn't watch the door like he used to. He just listened to her quiet breathing, the rise and fall of her chest, and thought that maybe, at last, he no longer feared being alone. The next few days passed slowly but full. The snow began to retreat. The wind still bit at sunrise, but the skies opened more, and the light stretched past dusk. It gave the cabin a new rhythm. Wake, work, warm up, sleep, and in between, something quiet began to take hold. It wasn't just surviving anymore. It was existing. Eva never spoke of the kiss again, nor did Ezra. But everything had changed. She moved with a new ease, came closer. She was deliberate in how she stood beside him. When she handed him tools, her fingers brushed his arm, and lingered a second longer than they needed to. And though she said nothing, that gesture spoke for her. "I remember. You didn't force me. I see you." And Ezra, he no longer pulled away. They didn't speak more than needed. But every time Iva passed, Ezra's eyes followed her for a moment. And each time he stepped out onto the porch, she glanced over to see if he was watching her. And many times, he was. That morning, Ezra saddled up for the first time in weeks and rode out toward the lower pass. He needed salt and to check the traps near the aspen grove. He left before dawn. The others were still asleep. Only Iva watched him go. She didn't ask where he was headed. She just held out his coat while he slipped into it, and quietly fixed the collar with a calm, steady hand. Ezra rode out with the sun rising behind him, cutting through the snow in golden silence. He returned early in the afternoon. From the top of the ridge, the cabin looked different. Smoke curled from the chimney. The shed door had been mended. The firewood stacked neat along the wall. Everything was in its place. But the air felt different. The silence carried another weight. Ezra sensed it before he saw a thing. He dismounted and scanned the grounds. Then the door opened. Sorrel stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "We had visitors," she said. Ezra's jaw tightened. Who was it? A white man, maybe mid-30s. Wore a deputy's star, but came on foot. Said he was from town. Didn't mention Wolf Hollow. Claimed he was looking for 2 stolen mules or so, he said. Ezra stepped past her and went inside. The others were seated. They looked calm, except for Taya, whose eyes were red. She had cried. Not anymore, but she had. Eva stood by the window, arms crossed. He didn't come for the mules, she said. He saw us from the road, started asking who we were if we had papers. Did he touch anyone? Ezra asked, voice low. No, Iva replied. He just asked questions. Wanted to know what we were doing here. Said we should be under someone's authority. What did you tell him? That you were our employer. That we cooked and cleaned in exchange for food and shelter. That we weren't prisoners. That he could move along. Ezra looked at the table. On the wood, a ring of melted snow marked where his cup had been. His cup. He stepped out onto the porch, scanned the horizon. No fresh tracks along the fence. The wind had erased them, or someone had, but the feeling remained. He spent the afternoon outside, splitting wood and watching the hill. Eyes hard. Still. Iva came out before sundown. She leaned against the post beside him. We should go, she murmured. Ezra didn't answer. He might come back, with more men, with more questions. If he meant to do that, Ezra said, he wouldn't have come alone the first time. Iva folded her arms. You think we're safe here? Here. More than out there. She was quiet for a moment. Taya froze when he asked her name, she said. She almost cried. He saw it. You could see the fear in her. She lied, yes, but she was shaking all over. She's young, Ezra replied, and she's already been married off before. Eva looked at him. She's not the only one. Ezra nodded. I know. That night, the fire burned hotter than usual. Ezra stayed awake near the door. Sorrel, too, sharpening a knife. Iva rested near the window, eyes open, unblinking. No one said it, but everyone knew. The outside world had seen them now. They were no longer invisible. And still, no one ran. The next morning, Ezra took Taya with him to the shed. Just the 2 of them. He showed her how to lock the door properly, how to set traps, how to read signs in the snow, broken branches, footprints, wind direction. Taya said little, but her hands stopped trembling. When they came back, Taya glanced at Iva and gave her a small nod. Iva said nothing. She just held her gaze, like someone watching another grow. Later, while the others stitched and scraped hides, Ezra and Iva stepped out behind the cabin. She handed him a cup of tea made from boiled root. He took it. I was wrong, she said. About what? Thinking we'd be a burden if we stayed. You weren't. She looked at him. There was no doubt in her eyes now, just something steady. Something she already knew but needed to hear out loud. And now? Iva asked softly. Are we a burden now? Ezra didn't answer right away. He leaned in slowly, gently, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, No. She stepped in closer and kissed him again. This time it was different. Longer. Clearer. Neither looked to see if anyone was watching. And this time, she didn't pull away. She stayed there, beside him, her hand in the pocket of his coat, her shoulder against his arm. The 2 of them, in silence, watching the woods. By late December, the snow came back heavy, wet, and thick. It soon rose to waist height. The cabin became a fortress, not by choice but by necessity. For 3 days, no one stepped outside. They rationed the firewood. The goats were sheltered in the shed. Water was melted straight from snow. Meals stretched longer, but no one complained. Inside, the work never stopped. Sorel built a frame near the stove to dry wet boots. Deli-boiled herbs she'd saved in tied bundles. Their sharp, clean scent cut through the thick smoke in the air. Marnie patched the roof from inside, sewing leather pieces together. Taya, for her part, rested more. Her wound nearly healed. And she spoke more freely. Not long sentences, but enough to ask where the sugar was, or if she could tend the fire. Iva stayed close to Ezra. They didn't share a bed. Not yet. But they shared a rhythm. They split wood side by side. He offered her an extra coat when he saw her shivering. She brushed the snow off his back when he returned from the shed. At night, they sat closer together. Their knees touched beneath the table. Sometimes her hand rested on his thigh for a moment. Brief, like a promise that didn't need words. It was on the 4th day of snow when the question that had hung in the air was finally spoken out loud. It was Marnie who asked it. She stood by the table after dinner, drying her hands on her skirt. Her eyes fixed on Ezra. "What happens in spring?" Silence filled the cabin. The stew pot was still steaming in the center of the table. Eva looked at him. Sorel stopped tightening the rope. Deli froze. Ezra didn't lower his gaze. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. Marnie's voice was steady. "That man from Wolf Hollow could come back, others too. We're 5 Apache widows living in a white man's house. Even if you haven't done anything wrong, they won't see it that way." Iva spoke up, firm. "He hasn't done anything wrong." "None of us have," added Deli. "But the law doesn't care," murmured Sorel. Ezra leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked beneath him. "I know what the law says," he replied. "And I know what this land says too. No one survives the winter alone. Out here, you live or die together. In the spring, we'll make it look however it needs to look." Iva frowned. Ezra looked at each of them. "I've got records, paperwork. I could write down that I've taken on 5 helpers for the ranch, 5 legal hands, registered." Sorel raised an eyebrow. "And the town will just believe that?" "They don't have to believe it," Ezra said. "It just needs to be stamped. No one looks too close, unless they're looking for trouble." Iva studied him, still. "You'd do that?" Ezra met her eyes. "I already did something worse, remember?" She didn't reply, but she understood. He had opened the door to them. That was more than any signature. Marnie let out a short laugh. Then Deli. Even Sorel allowed herself a faint smile. Eva didn't laugh, but she stood up, walked over to Ezra, and kissed him. It wasn't long. It wasn't to prove anything. It was enough. That night, after the fire died down and the others had fallen asleep, Iva didn't return to her corner. She stayed beside Ezra, behind his chair. Slowly, she wrapped her arms around his shoulders, rested her cheek against the back of his neck. He raised a hand and touched her forearm. Neither of them spoke. Then she moved in front of him, kneeling between his legs. Her worn buckskin dress still clung to her skin. Her chest rose slowly. The neckline stretched and faded from use. Her skin warm, despite the cold. Her thighs marked by days of kneeling, working, enduring. Ezra closed his eyes. And he didn't think about the past. He thought about staying. Eva leaned in and kissed him again. This time, deeper. She took his hands and guided them gently, placing them where she wanted, on her hips, her waist, her back. Ezra didn't rush. There was no force, no hunger, only a steady, restrained, patient touch. Her breathing grew heavier. She eased herself onto his lap, pressing her body against his, still without a word. They made love in silence. No bed, no ceremony, just skin to skin, shared warmth between the flickering light of the fire and the darkness wrapping around them. When it was over, she stayed curled on top of him, her hand open on his chest, her cheek resting on his shoulder. And Ezra, for the first time in his life, held someone with both arms, not to save her, not to protect her, but so he wouldn't have to let go. Outside, the storm still raged. But inside, they had built something that held strong. At dawn, when the snow finally eased and light slipped through the cracks, no one spoke about what had happened. But the air had changed. It wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. Now, they were surviving together, and none of them thought about leaving. The first clear morning after the storm came sharp and blinding. Blades of sunlight cut across the snowbanks like knives. The wind had stilled. Snow covered the cabin up to chest height in some spots. The path to the well had vanished beneath the white. One side of the shed roof had collapsed. But inside, the warmth held, not just from firewood, but from something else that had finally started to take root. Iva woke up in Ezra's room. Before the sun rose, she got up in silence. She returned to her blanket as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Ezra didn't hide it. Neither did she, and no one asked. That was the language they all spoke now. Silence as respect. By mid-morning, they were outside, clearing snow. Ezra shoveled from the porch to the shed. Sorrel chipped ice off the roof. Deli and Marnie cleaned the pen. Taya, without her bandage for the first time in days, hobbled along the path Ezra had cleared, carrying a bucket with both hands. Her face was red from the cold, but on her lips lived a small smile. It was Iva who spotted the tracks first. She was near the north fence, scraping mud from the base of a post. There they were, fresh, deep footprints, not from any of them. She didn't shout. She just walked back to the porch and locked eyes with Ezra. He understood at once. They walked the edge of the property together, found the trail near the trees. Someone had come from the south, circled wide, and left. They didn't come close. They didn't call out. They just watched. "Same man?" Iva asked. "Could be," Ezra answered quietly. "Or something worse." They followed the tracks to the ridge. The snow had already started to erase them. Too late to follow. When they returned, the women were gathered near the fire. Taya looked frightened again. Marnie stood with arms crossed. Deli was clutching the same scrap of sewing she'd had for minutes, still unable to thread the needle. Ezra came in and set the rifle down on the table. "If someone's watching, it means they don't want to be seen." "Still," said Iva, folding her arms, "they're not coming for mules anymore." Ezra looked at each of them, serious. "You don't have to wait for me to say it. If any of you want to leave before spring comes, I'll help you pack, load the wagon. I can even ride with you all the way to Fort Kavanaugh." No one moved. It was Deli who spoke first. "Go where? Back to what? There's no tribe waiting for us." "And if we went, they'd split us up again," added Sorrel. "Some might be accepted, others wouldn't." Marnie said nothing. She just walked over to Ezra, took his hand, and laced 2 of her fingers into his. Ezra looked at her, surprised. "I don't want to leave," she said. He held her gaze. "Then don't." Eva nodded in silence, and for the first time, in everyone's eyes, there wasn't just resolve. There was belonging. "I don't either," Iva added. The others didn't speak, but they didn't have to. The decision was already in the air. That night, Ezra checked the windows twice. He placed his rifle by the door and pulled out the old kitchen knife he hadn't touched in months, sharpening it patiently. Eva helped stack more firewood. Sorrel blocked the lower half of the chimney, just in case someone tried to choke out the smoke. They weren't panicking. They were preparing. Later, when everything fell quiet under the flickering glow of the fire, Ezra sat on the edge of his bed and rested his head in his hands. He breathed deeply, not out of fear, but from the weight of it all. He had spent years with that room empty, years where the only sounds were his own voice, or the wind slipping through the boards. And now, the space was full. 5 women, each with her own wound, her own strength, her own way of enduring, and somehow all of them trusted him. Eva came over without a sound. She knelt beside him, her hand rested firmly on his thigh. "You didn't ask for this," she murmured. "No," Ezra said, "but I didn't run either." He looked at her in the firelight, her hair loose, the bruises nearly gone. She looked stronger, more present. Her dress was still torn at the chest, but now it looked like armor. Not something broken, something that endured. She leaned in and kissed him. Slow, certain. She wasn't seeking comfort. She was seeking truth. "We're staying," she whispered. "If they come, we stand." Ezra wrapped a hand around the back of her neck and rested his forehead against hers. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't need to. Outside, snow was falling again. But inside, they were ready. Not just to endure, but to remain. To defend what they already felt as theirs. The storm ended in the second week of January. What remained was mud, broken ice, and hardened earth. The creeks began to stir beneath the crust of white. Steam rose from the shingles when the sun hit. The light had changed. Longer, cleaner, as if calling them toward spring. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. Each day after the thaw, Ezra walked the trail up the ridge twice. Once at dawn, once before dusk, always with the rifle. He never found anything new. No fresh prints, no snapped branches, no drag marks. Who had it been? Had they left? Or just knew how to hide better? Inside, the rhythm of the cabin settled into something deeper. Taya no longer limped. Now she helped Sorrel patch the corral wall, hammering planks without complaint. Deli baked with what little flour remained, and though she rarely smiled, Ezra told her her bread reminded him of his mother's. And that was enough for her. Marnie, always the quietest, began carving little drawings into the walls. Small symbols, gentle figures, scratched with the tip of a knife. She never explained what they meant. No one asked. Eva stayed close to Ezra. They no longer avoided each other. She slept in his room. Her dress was still torn, just like in the beginning. But now she didn't fix it because she didn't want to. Because she knew Ezra saw her for who she was. And he never made her feel less. He kissed her every night. Sometimes slow, sometimes long, sometimes with a silent urgency, but one that ran deep. They didn't speak of love. But it was there, in the way they moved around each other, in how she reached for him when her hands were cold, in how he stirred the coffee before handing it to her, in how they sat close, saying nothing, knees just barely touching. And in that slight touch, there was more truth than in 1,000 words. It was Eva who finally said out loud what the others had probably been thinking for days. It was late, the cabin nearly dark. Her head rested on Ezra's chest. "When spring comes and the sheriff returns," she whispered, What will we say? Ezra gently stroked her hair, thoughtful. It'll depend on what he asks. He'll ask if we're yours, she said plainly. If we belong here. Ezra didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was steady. Then yes. Iva lifted her head slightly, barely wrapped in the blanket. Her warm skin glowed in the firelight. Her eyes were certain. All of us? She asked slowly. All of us? Not just as working hands, not just mouths to feed. Do you mean it, Ezra? He looked her straight in the eye. I mean it. The next morning, Ezra pulled the old ledger from beneath his bed. Tucked among the dusty pages were old county documents, land records, and a half-dried stamp. He sat at the table while the women sewed, and began to write. One by one, in firm handwriting, Iva Redbird, Deli, Sorrel, Taya, Marnie. He registered them as permanent residents, noted under the protection of the home. Not as property, but as family. He didn't ask permission. He just did it. When he finished, he handed the pages to Sorrel. She read them without saying a word, then nodded, and passed them to Deli. By nightfall, each of them had read her name, and none of them packed a thing. The next day, Ezra hitched up the wagon and took the long road to Canyon Post. It took nearly the whole day, but when he returned, the papers were signed, stamped, and filed. Legal. By sunset, they were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were a home. That night, Iva waited for him by the fire. She didn't say a word. She just stood, slowly loosened the ties of her dress, and stepped into his arms. Ezra held her tight. He kissed her like it was the first time. Touched her like he'd waited his whole life to be chosen. They made love again. Slowly. Without fear. Without shadows. Her body was warm and alive beneath his. Her mouth found his with tenderness, no rush guiding him. She didn't pull away. She didn't hide. She let him know her fully. Afterward, wrapped in the glow of the firelight, Iva looked at him with a tired half-smile. You know what they'll call us? She whispered. Ezra kissed her bare shoulder. Let them talk. You gave us more than shelter, she murmured. You gave me more than silence. And you gave me the same, he replied. In the corner, Taya stirred in her sleep. Sorrel turned over in her blanket. Marnie let out a single snore. Deli muttered something in Apache and shifted sides. The cabin, which had once been a place of shadows and memories, that night was home. Not borrowed, not fleeting, but real. By week's end, Ezra knew with certainty that spring had arrived. Not because the valley was in bloom, but because no one talked about leaving anymore, because all of them were where they were meant to be. Spring didn't come all at once. It came like a whisper, in the smell of damp earth, in the thin stream trickling down the hill, in the quiet song of birds at dawn. By mid-March, the snow had almost vanished from the valley, and between the stones, small patches of green began to appear. The cabin, weathered and blackened by winter, stood firm beneath the open sky. Danger didn't return. The stranger from Wolf Hollow never came back. No riders, no questions. But Ezra stayed alert. Each morning he checked the tree line. Each afternoon he walked down to the creek. Not out of fear, out of habit, because protecting wasn't panic. It was presence. Inside the cabin, everything had changed. Not in big ways, in small, lasting ones. Taya hung a mobile made of bone and string above the window. Deli dried herbs over the stove. Marnie kept drawing new symbols each week, some in charcoal, some in color. Sorrel patched up the porch and placed a wooden bench she'd built herself. And with each gesture, The same message was spoken. We're staying. Eva began planting corn beside the shed. One row at first, then another, as the ground softened. Ezra started to smile again. Not a big smile, not often, but a real one. The women had made space for him without asking him to stop being who he was, and because of that, without realizing it, he changed. Naturally, slowly. He was no longer a man who flinched at being touched, no longer someone who guarded every word like it might be his last. He never expected to have a family, but now he did. And the folks in town noticed. The rumor spread through the post office in Canyon Post. Ezra Marsh had taken in 5 Apache widows at his home. No one knew if it was out of compassion, marriage, or scandal. But by April, the gossip died down. The day the county clerk came by for a routine check and found the cabin clean, the papers in order, the women working the land, and smiling at the man who had registered their names with respect. There was nothing left to say. No law broken, just silence. One afternoon, under an orange sky and warm air, Ezra stepped out behind the cabin. Iva was rinsing clothes in a wash basin. Her hands were wet, and the dress clung to her hips. She looked at him over her shoulder. "You're breathing hard," she said. "Been hauling rocks," he replied. "You sound like an old man." "I am an old man," he said, smiling. She squinted, tilting her head. "Not that old." Ezra stepped closer. "I want to ask you something." "You can't ask me to leave now," she said, crossing her arms. "It's way too late for that." He shook his head. "I want you to marry me." She looked him straight in the eye. No surprise, no smile just yet. "Is this about the law?" "To keep the others away." "No." She searched his face. "Then why?" Ezra swallowed. "Because you're the strongest person I've ever known. Because when I wake up, the first thing I look for is you. Because when I think about 10 winters from now, I think about this. All of this. You. This home. This life." Eva let out a slow breath. Her arms dropped. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against his chest. Her fingers clutched at his shirt. "I never thought I'd belong to anyone again," she whispered. "But I'll be yours." Ezra kissed the top of her head. "Only if you want to." "I want to," she said. "But I'm not wearing white." He chuckled low. "I didn't ask you to." "Good," she said with a sly grin. "Because I'm not changing this dress either, torn up as it still is." Ezra looked at her. The bare shoulder, the rip across her chest, the shimmer of her skin under sun and water. "I wouldn't want you in anything else," he said. They were married beneath the fir tree behind the cabin, 2 days later. No preacher, no paperwork, just the two of them, and the others watching. Sorrel stood beside Iva, arms crossed but smiling. Deli held the braid Iva had woven into her own hair, an Apache tradition passed from woman to woman. Marnie carved a symbol into the trunk, a joined circle, permanent. Taya brought wildflowers from the ridge and laid them at their feet. Ezra said only one line: "You stay with me, and I stay with you." Iva replied, "Then we stay." And that was enough. The sun warmed them. The earth received them. The wind passed by, but took nothing with it. That evening, as sunset fell over Silverbot, and the goats were already quiet, Ezra sat on the porch with Iva in his lap, her back against his chest. Inside, the others laughed. Someone, maybe Marnie, was singing a soft melody, unfamiliar but warm. Eva's hand rested on her belly. Ezra noticed it, but said nothing. Yet. She turned her head. "In a few months," she said. Ezra held her tighter. "Are you afraid?" She shook her head. Not anymore. Ezra looked out over the field. The corn was just beginning to sprout. They won't understand, he murmured. They don't need to, she smiled. And they stayed quiet. Two people who had lost everything, but found the one thing worth more. They stayed. And that was love. That was the ending. That was home. If this story touched you, we invite you to join us in discovering more true stories from the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who carved the path. Subscribe, share, leave us your thoughts in the comments, and ride with us once more through this untamed land. Thank you.